Hey, how's it going? This is Eno and welcome. Today I thought I would do a part 2 companion to the video I posted last week about the FBI's decision to return to 9mm ammunition after literally decades of using the .40 Smith & Wesson, a round that they had a lot to do with its development. In the previous video, we went through the summary of justification for the FBI's decision to use 9mm. So we went through point by point all the different reasons in a summary context of why the FBI made the decision. In this particular video, I wanted to look more closely at the long form of the report and get a little bit more in-depth onto some of the wound track and ballistic information and some of the myths that the FBI talks about when it comes to why they made the decision that they made, that 9mm is the superior round for law enforcement. Before I get started, I want to make 2 points. Number one, I am not here to advocate 9mm. We're simply looking at the FBI's decision to use 9mm. The reasons why an agency like the FBI, encompassing thousands of individuals across the board of varying abilities and sizes and men and women, big and small across the board, and trying to make a decision balancing costs and performance about one type of ammunition and one type of weapons platform across an agency like that, that's a very different decision than what we make as individuals for what we want to shoot at home. And you are free to exercise your Second Amendment rights to shoot the types of weapons platforms you want to shoot and shoot the types of ammunition that you want to shoot. And across the board, rifle, pistol, revolver, shotgun, they all bring different platforms and different ammunitions that have virtues that make them fun and interesting to shoot. And we are free to make these decisions as we feel applies to us, as far as the cost and what we can control and what we enjoy carrying and so on and so forth. And we also make decisions about ammunition and weapons platforms that don't always have anything to do with lethality. We just do it because we enjoy the sport of shooting and collecting different handguns and ammunition. So I'm not here to tell you what's right and wrong. I'm just here to go through the FBI's decision. The second point I want to make here is that I typically don't get into the handgun caliber debate because, again, I think it's pointless. Choosing the best handgun caliber to me is a lot like choosing the prettiest turd in the toilet. Handguns across the board just suffer from certain inherent limitations as far as power and velocity and accuracy when you're, especially long range, when you compare them to a handgun, you compare them to like a rifle. So we're dealing with just certain inherent limitations here, and really the difference between a lot of the rounds, especially the law enforcement rounds, 9mm, 40 and 45 ACP, and we're also looking here at 357 SIG and 10mm. The differences between a lot of those rounds are really a lot less than some people would like to make them out to be. So without further ado, let's get into the long form of the report and get into some of these issues as far as wound track information and some ballistics information and some myths. The selection of an effective handgun ammunition for law enforcement is both a critical and a complex issue. It's critical because of what's at stake. This is a life and death decision, a law enforcement protecting his or her own life or the life of another. So this is life and death here. It's complex because the human body is amazingly durable and capable of sustaining a phenomenal punishment while persisting in a determined course of action. It's also complex because of the lack of credible research and wealth of uninformed opinion regarding such myths as stopping power and hydrostatic shock and many others. The goal that you want to achieve when shooting a firearm, shooting a handgun in a shootout, is immediate incapacitation. That is your goal. There are only 2 shots that will achieve immediate incapacitation, and that is a shot to the head resulting in brain damage and shots to the upper central nervous system. Those are the only 2 shots where immediate incapacitation can be virtually guaranteed. All other shot placements have too many variables to be able to guarantee immediate incapacitation. It is impractical to train officers in handgun training for headshots. It's simply impractical. Remember, as we stated before in the previous video, even well-trained, highly trained law enforcement agents miss between 70 and 80% of their shots. So what we do with handgun training and law enforcement handgun training is we concentrate on placing shots in center mass, especially the upper torso. And when we start to do that, when we place shots on center mass, penetration becomes the most important thing. Getting that penetration through to the blood-filled internal organs to achieve rapid blood loss and hopefully a quick end to the gun battle. So that's what we're looking at. Again, these shot placements, even in center mass, have too many variables to be able to guarantee immediate incapacitation. And we have a lack of credible research on this simply because there are way too many variables. You would need shooting data from a mind-boggling amount of shooting instances to be able to arrive at a scientific conclusion. Even hundreds and hundreds of instances of shooting data are not statistically enough to be able to make a scientific conclusion. So let's move on to the mechanics of projectile wounding. There are basically four mechanics. Number one is penetration, which we've already talked about in the previous video at quite some length. Number two is the permanent cavity. Number three is the temporary cavity. And number four is fragmentation. So penetration, and again, remember the FBI has a penetration standard of 12 to 18 inches, is the actual how deep the bullet goes into the target. The permanent cavity is the actual tunnel or the hole that that bullet makes in the body when it enters. So it's that hole that is equal to the diameter of the bullet. So it's everything that comes in contact with the bullet as it enters. The temporary cavity is the expansion of that permanent cavity due to the force of the bullet entering. So when you look at, for instance, wound track information, ballistics, gel testing, and things like that, you'll see this this secondary expansion that happens when you shoot a pistol or any caliber of ammunition into ballistics gel. You're going to see this cavitation, this expansion into the secondary cavity, and that's called the temporary cavity. Okay, and the fourth is fragmentation, or the bullet beginning to break up inside the target. All handgun wounds will combine components of penetration, the permanent cavity, and the temporary cavity. Fragmentation does not occur reliably in handgun wounds due to the relatively low velocities. The occurrence of reliable fragmentation only occurs in projectiles in excess of 2,000 feet per second. And with handgun ammunition, we're typically operating less than 1,500, and in most cases less than 1,400. And in some cases, like 45 ACP, we're dealing with around 1,000 or under. So we're not even close in handgun ammunition to getting to that 2,000 feet per second threshold to really get reliable fragmentation of a wound, or of a bullet in a wound. If you begin to try and make bullets with a specific goal of fragmenting, the trade-off to that is lack of penetration. And again, penetration is number one of our mechanics of projectile wounding. So if you start making a bullet that fragments, you're going to reduce its penetration. The little fragmentation that does occur in handgun rounds typically is going to be centered around the permanent cavity, so we're not seeing that fragmentation moving out into the surrounding tissue. So fragmentation is typically not really that big of a deal with a handgun caliber. The temporary cavity is frequently and grossly overrated as far as a factor of wounding in a gunshot wound. So the temporary cavity is that cavitation of the bullet that expands the surrounding tissue and then it returns back again. Historically, this is used as a primary means of assessing wound effectiveness of bullets, that expansion of the temporary cavity. The FBI dismisses one of probably the most famous reports that's been done specifically on temporary cavity expansion. And this is frequently described by a lot of people as hydrostatic shock. So it's that expansion of the temporary cavity. Hydrostatic shock is a theory about why that expansion happens. Okay? So there was a report done by the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, and it's called the Relative Incapacitation Index. And the FBI actually dismisses the index because it's based on prior assumption that temporary cavity, that all temporary cavity expansion wounds secondary tissue. And in fact, they never really established a threshold where the expansion of the tissue results in wounding of that tissue. Because the problem is, human tissue is elastic. It can move. And this is one of the problems you run into when you look at some videos of people just trying to demonstrate some of the differences between different handgun ammunitions. And one of the most common ones that I see out there, especially on YouTube, is people shooting fruit. So they'll get, watermelons or pumpkins or something, and they'll shoot it with a 45 ACP, and then they'll shoot another one with a 9mm. And the one that they shoot with the 45 ACP, that watermelon just explodes. It almost eviscerates. And then they shoot it with a 9mm, and the damage is not nearly as dramatic, if you will. The problem is that we are not watermelons. And the human tissue is extremely elastic, a lot more than a lot of people consider. And even though there is this expansion of the temporary cavity, you have to establish what the expansion needs to be in order to wound that surrounding tissue. Okay, to say that it happens is not to say that it's effective. All right? Frequently, forensic pathologists cannot distinguish wound tracks from hollow points that result in large temporary cavities or solid bullets that result in small temporary cavities. Because what happens is you have the permanent cavity, you have the expansion in the temporary cavity, that elastic tissue begins to come back around, and later on when the forensic pathologist looks at that wound track, they can't tell if you've been shot with a hollow point or with a solid bullet because there's no damage to that surrounding tissue. So it looks the same virtually. The bullet produces a direct path of destruction with very little lateral extension within the surrounding tissue. To cause significant injury to a structure, a pistol bullet must strike that structure directly. So in order to cause damage to something, this bullet has to physically hit it. You can't rely on that expansion of the temporary cavity to cause secondary wounding. Tissue disruption is caused by two different mechanisms, the crush mechanism and the stretch mechanism. The crush is the actual bullet penetrating the tissue. The stretch is that expansion of the temporary cavity. In a rifle round, tissue damage is done by both crush and stretch mechanisms. In a handgun round, the crush mechanism is the only wounding mechanism found in law enforcement handgun calibers. Temporary cavitation is nothing more than the stretch of the tissue. Elastic tissue sustains little, if any, residual damage. So to break this down into layman's terms, because handgun caliber bullets are not traveling in excess of 2,000 feet per second, we're not seeing enough expansion of that temporary cavity to exceed the elastic nature of human tissue. The only way you're going to see the expansion of that temporary cavity to exceed the elastic nature of human tissue is to use a rifle round, which is going to be in excess of 2,000 feet per second, which is going to give you rapid expansion and major expansion of the wound cavity that will result in tearing and destruction of the surrounding tissue. So in over 2,000 feet per second, we have not only the permanent cavity, but we also have the expansion wounding damaging the surrounding tissue. But that's only going to happen in rifle rounds over 2,000 feet per second. We're not cooking fast enough in handgun rounds pretty much across the board. Barring brain and central nervous system hits, there is no physiological reason for an individual to be incapacitated by even a fatal wound until loss of blood is sufficient enough to drop blood pressure. So there's nothing physiological that's going to happen outside of a direct hit to the head or upper central nervous system that's going to give you a reason to result in immediate incapacitation. Psychological factors are actually more important relatively to achieve rapid incapacitation. And this is the whole issue of whether or not you're aware of the injury and your notions of what people are supposed to do when they're shot. This is actually a really interesting point that the FBI makes. When they began looking at different data as far as people being shot, what they found, one of the things that they found was that when an individual is not aware that he's been shot, he or she has been shot, and this does happen quite routinely. I shouldn't say quite routinely, but it does happen. Excuse me. They find that in those situations, the person is often unfazed by the impact of the bullet or by the wound. And a lot of times doesn't realize until after the fact that they've even been shot. However, if the person, either good guy or bad guy, is aware that they've actually been shot, the instance of that shot resulting in immediate or rapid incapacitation rises dramatically, even though the wound caused by the gun or by the bullet might not be much different. So if you are psychologically aware that you've just been shot, you are far more likely to go down than if you aren't aware of the shot. Because again, we're taking into consideration the psychological factors of being shot, the fear of death, the fear of being shot, and the notions of what people are supposed to do when they are shot. So that's a really interesting statement. So let's take a moment to talk about the momentum, kinetic energy, what is sometimes referred to, or oftentimes referred to, as muzzle energy, which is really just a fancy insider term for kinetic energy of a bullet. The impact of a bullet on the body is no more than the recoil of the gun. This is basic physics. This is Newton. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Okay? Across the board, in most 9mm platforms, the impact of a 9mm bullet is the equivalent of dropping a 10-pound weight from a distance of 0.72 inches off the ground. So less than an inch. The kinetic energy impact of a .45 is equivalent to dropping a 10-pound weight from a distance of 1.37 inches off the ground. Now that was not an accurate measurement of how high I brought that off the ground, so don't place any anything into how loud the two different ones were. I didn't measure that at all. So I have no idea if the first one was 0.72 inches off the ground, and I have no idea if the second one was 0.37 inches off the ground. The point to make there is dropping this thing, no more than about, than a couple of inches is not a lot. Okay, that's not a lot of momentum. And it is very capable, the body is very capable of absorbing that type of a hit. So, this Hollywood, sort of somebody be shot with a gun and shot with a bullet and getting flown through a window. Okay, if that's indeed the case, then your ass is flying through a window as the shooter on the other side of the room, because every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So if you have a gun that's producing enough knockdown power to actually blow your assailant down, you're going down too, because that is pretty much always going to be equal. And the actual force through which a bullet impacts you, as we can demonstrate with the 10-pound weight analogy, is not really all that much. Most people, when they describe what it feels like to be hit with a handgun caliber, typically describe it as being punched. And I don't mean like punch like your buddy punches you in the side of the arm or something like that. I'm talking about actually being punched. So that's an important consideration to take, that when we're talking about kinetic energy, there's just not enough kinetic energy to knock you down or to incapacitate you. In fact, the human body is fully capable of absorbing a .45 ACP round without much of a problem. Okay, and I'm not saying that it's not going to wound you, but that kind of force, if you took that kind of force and pushed the human body with that type of force, that's really not that much. The body should be able to absorb that. The point of a handgun caliber, the point of any bullet, is to take that energy and put it down into a little itty-bitty projectile, and I don't mean super small, but a little projectile, so that you can achieve that penetration. So we're taking that broad amount of force and you know, like when you feel the recoil of a gun, and then we're shrinking that down just into that bullet, and so that we can achieve that penetration that we need into our handgun round. And we must penetrate at least 12 inches, regardless of whether it expands, regardless of whether we have temporary cavity, secondary tissue damage. All of those other things are aside. We must achieve at least 12 inches regardless of penetration, regardless of all those other factors. Now, some people will, excuse me, look at these different types of ammunition and say, well, if all these things are pretty much the same, you know, if fragmentation is not really much of an issue, if expansion of the secondary cavity is not really a factor under 2,000 feet per second, then we're going to go with surface area. A 45 caliber bullet is just bigger than a 9mm, and if you're only going to damage what you come in direct contact with, then the 45 is going to do more damage. Well, you'd think. Technically, that is true, okay? But as the FBI points out, the significance cannot be quantified because there are other variables at work here, okay? So let's take into consideration two different types of very popular ammunition that a lot of people like to use. And I'm not saying that everybody uses this stuff, but two very popular ammunitions. And that's Federal Hydroshock, which again, hydrostatic shock is a myth, but Federal Hydroshock, here we got a marketing ploy going on to try to get you to buy their ammo, and Federal HST. So I don't have those types of ammunition. We just have target loads here is what I'm using for kind of demonstration purposes. In Hydroshock, 9mm achieved a penetration of 13.3 inches. The 45 ACP achieved 13.7 inches of penetration. So very, very close. The 9mm, this is a hollow-tipped round. The 9mm expanded to 67.67 inches, and the 45 ACP expanded to 0.71 inches. So we're at 4/100ths of an inch difference in expansion. The 9mm achieved tissue damage of 48.8 square inches. So that's a total surface area of tissue damaged. The 45 ACP produced 28.4 square inches of tissue damage. So here we have penetration being a little bit better, slightly, almost to the point where it's negligible, but slightly more with the 45, and we achieved 4/100ths of an inch more expansion in the 45 than the 9mm. However, the 45 did almost half of the amount of damage that the 9mm did in Federal Hydroshock. And this is the numbers as done in the FBI's testing. A lot of that has to do with velocity. Okay, the 9mm is cooking probably around 12 or 1,300 feet per second. The 45 ACP, be lucky if it gets to 1,000. But that's primarily the variable that's at work here. Or one of the variables that's at work here that's causing this difference. But here we have, you know, more expansion and a little bit more penetration, but half the amount of wound damage. And that doesn't make a lot of sense when you say this is not logical. But this is why that diameter of the actual bullet cannot be significantly quantified. You can't just make the statement that this thing's bigger, therefore it's going to touch more stuff, therefore it's going to do more damage. Because as we look at the FBI's testing of Federal Hydroshock, we see that that's just simply not the case. When we look at Federal HST ammunition, I don't mean to pick on Federal here. There's a ton of different ammunition that the FBI tested and put in this. I'm just pulling out these two. If you look at Federal HST, which is another really popular round that a lot of people like to use for self-defense, things like that, the difference in penetration is about 1/2 inch, so it's a little bit more. The 45 penetrated about 1/2 inch more than the 9mm, but both of them penetrated beyond the 12 inches required by the FBI. Okay, the 9mm I think was like a little over 12.5, and then the 45 ACP was around 13, give or take. The expansion of the two rounds was about 8/100ths of an inch difference. So we saw a little bit bigger gap between the expansion, but again, we're only talking about 8/100ths of an inch. And the wound tract damage, the total surface area of wound tract damage, slightly went in the favor of the 9mm. So we got a little bit more penetration out of the 45. We got a little bit more expansion out of the 45, and a little bit more than we saw in the Hydroshock, a little bit more of a difference. And the wound tract damage, and that caused this 45 to jump up in effectiveness and get up in that square inch of total wound tissue damage to get a little bit closer to that 9mm. But again, that total surface area of wounded tissue was about the same in the two rounds. So just because you have a larger diameter round doesn't necessarily mean you're making a lot more damage. The differences between these rounds, as you see when you start looking at this, like we see in the Federal HST, is fairly negligible. I mean, they're achieving almost the same thing. So one of the things that I brought up in the previous video was that developments in 9mm over the past 20 or 30 years has disproportionately affected 9mm ammunition over other types of ammunition. And some people commented about that statement in the video, and I wanted to address that right now. Okay? And the common question there, the typical question there in the comments was, how is it being, affected? What is your scientific proof? That's not quite that involved. It's actually really easy to explain. I don't need to use scientific studies and scientific analysis to explain why this is. It's actually very easy to understand. Okay? So the reason why the 9mm has seen a disproportionate increase in performance, as you see with the other two rounds over the last 20 to 30 years of ammunition development, is because there was a lot of potential in the 9mm. Okay? As you see today we have 9mm plus P, we have 9mm plus P plus. There's been a lot of work with the 9mm increasing compression and pressure to get this bullet to function a lot better. Okay? And so we've seen a lot of development. There's just a lot of potential there with the 9mm to really improve its ballistic performance that the other two calibers just don't have. Out of the box, a 40 Smith & Wesson is pretty much at the limits of compression and expansion. There's not really anywhere for the 40 Smith & Wesson to go. It's already there. That's basically it's already a high pressure round. There's no real potential beyond what it already is. So we're not seeing a lot of further development as far as velocities and penetration and stuff like that beyond what we already achieved with this design. Okay, and likewise for the 45, we do have 45 plus P rounds. There's been some of that, but again, the room for improvement there is not as dramatic as it was with the 9mm. So the reason why we've seen that disproportionate amount of performance increase with 9mm over the other two rounds is just because there was a lot more potential in the 9mm platform to achieve those kinds of advancements that we didn't have in the other types of ammunition. Physiologically, no caliber of bullet is certain to incapacitate any individual unless a brain or central nervous system hit is achieved. Psychologically, some people will be incapacitated by minor or small caliber wounds, and some people stimulated by such things as fear, adrenaline, drugs, alcohol, or sheer will not be incapacitated even if mortally wounded by a caliber. So again, that psychological aspect has a lot to do with whether or not you achieve immediate incapacitation. Let's take a look at basically a conclusion here, summing up, wrapping this up, coming down the home stretch. Kinetic energy does not wound. So muzzle energy, when you're looking at different handgun rounds, and everybody puts this on their website, it's got a muzzle energy of this. Some people even know the equation off the top of their head. But muzzle energy, kinetic energy, does not wound people. Penetration wounds people. Okay? A temporary cavity, the expansion of the temporary cavity, does not wound secondary tissue in handgun rounds under 2,000 feet per second, which most handgun rounds are. So we're simply not getting expansion of that temporary cavity beyond the elastic threshold of human tissue. So temporary cavity does not wound. Hydrostatic shock, which is a theory to explain the temporary cavity, that expansion, is a fable. The FBI calls it a fable. knockdown power is a myth. Okay? For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Knockdown power is a myth. The critical elements to have a desired outcome in a gun battle is to achieve penetration with proper shot placement, to wound the blood-filled internal organs, resulting in rapid blood loss. That is the entirety of your concern. And you can achieve that with any of the popular handgun loads. Now, if you watch the previous video that I made, the summary of justification video that I made last week, you'll see all the other different reasons that led the FBI to choose 9mm as the most effective law enforcement round. And personally, it is also my preferred round for self-defense for a lot of the same reasons. But I'm not advocating that to you. We can all make our own decisions. Thanks a lot for watching. Please feel free to post if you have any points, questions, anything like that. Remember, don't take it personally. You still shoot whatever you want to shoot. It's not about you. So don't take it personally. But by all means, post. Let me know what you think. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you very much.